About 4 years ago now, I released the Monster Meat theory. It was the second in my series of Don't Starve lore theories covering the various creatures and historical factions of the Constant from my point of view. The Monster Meat theory was dedicated to covering the mutagenic properties of monster meat and the consumption of nightmare fuel-like material to eventually produce new organisms entirely, and additionally the origin of what monster meat actually was. And since they happen to be fairly adjacent to this, I also briefly talked about Bunnymen and how them changing into these monster-like creatures when transformed coincided with the same aspects of monster meat and or nightmare fuel-induced mutations or hallucinations. And I figured I had a good enough answer at the time as to why, and that I wouldn't be talking about them again. However, then an update came out introducing a new king to the mix, being one that I never would have expected, at least in this manner, and it got me thinking. And then a whole new game was announced with, as you might have guessed, even more Bunnymen introduced, even briefly, this time with mechanical drill arms. So, I came to the idea that I had either gotten something wrong about them, or that there was simply more of their story to tell. And thus, I decided to take the case, this time just for them, to try and answer who the hell the Rabbit King is, and what these cyborg chimeric rabbit miner warriors are. This is the Bunny theory. But first, okay, here we go, Don't Starve theory number 8. I mainly do variety theories now, but I do still enjoy writing theories on the game where it all started. Not sure as of writing this how long this one will turn out to be, but as usual, keep in mind that although theories are really fun to make, they are also some of my hardest content to produce. So if you do enjoy the video, make sure you support me in whatever way you see fit, whether that be with a donation, becoming a member and joining the community on Discord, feeding me your hype, or just subbing with notifications and leaving me a comment giving your own thoughts on the video. All of it helps and gives me more time to create more theories like this one. With all that being said, I will now begin the theory. So, to begin with, what are we actually talking about here? And to understand that is to understand when it comes to rabbits or bunnymen or any other lagomorphs in the Constant, that there are two distinct groups that are similar and appear to be linked, but are also separate from each other. You have the first group you'll see, and the most normal to real life, you would assume being the rabbits, who, despite having little horns on their head like jackalopes, a fictional creature, just emerge from their burrows during the day, run around, eat carrots, berries, and other stuff thrown on the floor, and during dawn run back to their den with the only real divination from reality being when a player goes insane. And when a player goes insane, the seemingly ordinary rabbit will take on a more distorted, less traditional appearance. The smooth, tan, and white simple furs of the rabbit now appear as a bushy cacophony of messy hair. They lower the player's sanity more by just simply standing near them, and the game refers to them now as beardlings. Now, most would just immediately write this off as nothing more than a hallucination, and although that is very plausible, there's two things that suggest otherwise. One, that rabbits when they are killed as beardlings do not drop the same items as rabbits do, instead dropping items what their supposed hallucination state creature would drop, being monster meat, nightmare fuel, or most obviously, beard hair. And two, that there's only a few other creatures in the entire Constant that have this appearance-based transformation based on the player's own sanity, and one of them happens to be the other of the two groups, the Bunnymen. So, heading underground, we have these semi-humanoid-like sapient creatures known as the Bunnymen who live in giant carrot houses. All have names, can be befriended with, and appear to farm carrots, and strangely any player that holds meat near them. They are also invariably hostile towards monsters too, though have no other known aggressions towards other sometimes hostile factions, as they are neutral towards merms. Lastly, the Bunnymen once again share that same distorted hallucination form that rabbits have, as when the player is less than 40% staying, they take on a once again scruffled jet black beard hair color, and once again also drop loot comparable to their new form, beard hair and monster meat, and going by the name Beardlords now. Additionally, if you're playing in single player, Beardlords even do more damage than regular Bunnymen, once again leading to their Beardlord form being not simply just a hallucination on the player's part. Lastly, they have piercing red eyes, a trait not shared by many creatures in the Constant, except maybe Queen Womance guards. and my initial views on what exactly these creatures were was more or less of a loose conclusion for me to come to. The idea being that Bunnymen, despite not consuming monster meat and its mutagenic effects never taking hold on them, that since the ancients were bringing carrots underground, that carrots may not have grown there initially, and that when they came across the Bunnymen and the carrots started corrupting, when the Bunnymen consumed them, they more or less had an only half mutagenic effect in regards to the nightmare fuel. In other words, because Bunnymen never fully consumed nightmare-infused flesh, they only consumed the second-hand effects of corrupted carrots, potentially even generations after the ancients were wiped out. They were essentially inoculated against the full effects of the nightmare fuel. And to iron out this side is that they still show a mutagenic violent side when the walls of perception are opened by someone that is just as side as real as their own normal hallucinatory state. So I think they are actually physically dropping these items depending on the state, is simply due to the person killing them choosing which resources they see to harvest off their corpse. If it looks like a bunny, you're just going to be looking for the regular healthy meat and bunny fluff that a bunnyman would drop. But if you're stomping some mutant nightmare creature, you're going to be noticing all the beard hair and vile corrupted flesh and harvest that instead. The problem with my theory is that it doesn't entirely answer for the regular rabbits. And yeah, at the time, I had a safe answer for it, being just that corrupted carrots could have also been taken to the surface from the caves, and that's how both bunnymen and rabbits have their nightmare forms, and furthermore, probably why splamonkeys do too. We aren't fully done here yet, as there has been a completely new character added to the mix. So, let's go over everything we know about the Rabbit King. The Rabbit King is, well, I would assume the king of the rabbits. Finding any rabbit hole in the world and giving it anywhere from 12 to 16 carrots will shortly after cause the benevolent Rabbit King to appear in front of the player digging out of the soil. He is a large rabbit with gold-colored horns and a magnificent mustache. He raises your sanity by merely standing next to him, and he is even described in this form as the benevolent Rabbit King. The Rabbit King is basically just a merchant, but more likely just a crafting tab, as you're just spending the resources of what you would assume the item costs, and then he's giving it to you. Thus, it appears as though the king isn't actually requiring a payment from you at all after you summon him with carrots, as he's just taking your materials and crafting the item on your behalf, leading him to almost have a more benevolent nature to him after he is summoned with the carrots. Overall, the Bunny King appears on the surface to just be a friendly trader, with a more generous and positive alignment than most that we have seen. It's not even just that, as the benevolent Bunny King also has another way that he can be summoned that doesn't even require carrots. That is with the fortuitous rabbit, which has a chance of spawning from rabbit holes. Simply run up to it, and if you find it, interact with it, and it instantly transforms into the benevolent Bunny King. Almost as if the Rabbit King himself is just indulging you for playing into a friendly challenge with him and letting him perform some little parlor trick for you. However, the benevolent Rabbit King is also not a pushover in a fight, or at least he won't be if you make him angry, as he doesn't defend himself if a neutral mob attacks him, though I think this is just a game type thing. If you attack the benevolent Rabbit King, he quickly undergoes a transformation, swapping from the benevolent Rabbit King to the wrathful Rabbit King. His fur grays and blackens in areas, his antlers turn from gold to jet black, his eyes glow red, and his buck teeth transform into fangs. He then summons an entourage of 3 royal rabbit enforcers, who are hostile as long as they stick around, only leaving after the Rabbit King himself has been slain. Additionally, if any of the enforcers are slain during the fight, the Rabbit King will simply resummon them shortly after, while simultaneously jumping around and trying to dropkick you. This makes the Rabbit King, despite being one of the most unassuming, actually one of the more difficult early game boss fights. When slain, the wrathful Rabbit King will then drop some beard hair, as well as a unique weapon, with this being the only way to obtain it, the Rabbit King's cudgel. What it is essentially the Rabbit King's antler turned into a melee weapon that does slightly less damage than a hambat, but can potentially do so much more when you strike a Bunnyman or Rabbit Enforcer with it, as it drains some of your sanity to do 20 more damage. Overall, it's not a very good or worthwhile weapon in any capacity, considering you have to fight the king to get it. However, it also has the unique effect of scaring Bunnymen away from you by merely wielding it, causing Bunnymen to run even if you have meat or you are a monster. Now, hitting the Benevolent Rabbit King is not the only way to get a Wrathful Rabbit King. The King will turn wrathful at the mere sight of meat in the player's inventory as well, instantly turning hostile and chasing down the offending player, and the Wrathful Rabbit does not change back once turned either. Strangely though, despite turning wrathful for meat in the player's inventory, the Rabbit King isn't hostile to monster characters and will freely trade with both Wartox and Weber. Lastly, there is one other way to summon the Wrathful Rabbit King, and that is by slaying enough rabbits or bunnymen in a single setting, as they actually have a separate naughtiness meter alongside Krampus. Essentially, once the threshold is reached, the Rabbit King emerges from beneath the soil anywhere wherever the player is, murdering rabbits, and is already rabid and begins its attack instantly. This is despite the Rabbit King showing no care for slaying rabbits or bunnymen in front of it. Rather, it just despises that it's being done in excess. I honestly think you could interpret this either way. Either way, it shows that there is at least somewhat of a level of intentional world building in regards to the Rabbit King and the bunnymen and rabbits of the world, thus there's enough to theorize on. Going back to trades, there are only 3 items you can get from him, each being somewhat useful, but not exactly in-game level useful either. There's a horn he sells, which allows you to make basically portable dens that you can then pop items in, whereas a wreath, where you can make it when worn, it will make it so that rabbits will no longer run from you, and you can easily pick them up and even set them back down without them freaking out. And lastly, there is a chest piece made out of carrots, which will not only automatically tame bunnymen, but also mask the scent of meat in your inventory too. And this not only works for bunnymen, but for the Rabbit King himself as well, meaning he is actively crafting an item for you which you can use to deceive him with. And this isn't any mistake either in the game's design, as it states in the item's exact lore that this is actively one of the uses for the Coat of Carrots. So, 2 of the 3 items the King is selling to you are items that allow you to actively deceive the rabbit and bunnyman population. But for the most part, that's all the main content of the Rabbit King. On the surface it appears as nothing more than just a fun mob that doesn't have too much lore attached to it. However, a lot of this does seem intentional to me, given the obvious world building elements attached to it, like the Rabbit King emerging to protect against too many rabbits dying, or it being specifically mentioned in the Coat of Carrots to use the mask to scent of the meat. Though this, at the same time, feels somewhat of a contradiction, as the Rabbit King apparently cares to defend his people if you harm too many of them at a given time, however, at the same time has no problem selling you gear to help you not only deceive them, but himself, and even perform malicious acts as well with it, as it's more likely that than most players that are even getting the Warren Wreath, the hat that protects against scaring rabbits, are using it to mass farm and probably slay rabbits. And this is all after I previously spoke highly of the Rabbit King, even commenting on how generous he appears to be, and that he actually deserves the title of being called benevolent. So, what's going on here? Well, I have a theory as for why he acts this way. The Rabbit King is a vampire.
He couldn't have anything to do with Dracula. Besides, Dracula was a vampire.
Now, when I say the Rabbit King is a vampire out loud, I mean, yeah, he looks the type when he is in his wrathful state, but that sounds like complete and utter nonsense without me explaining it, and you would be right to assume that. However, there are a lot of elements here that not only make something like vampirism possible in the Don't Starve universe, but that it's actually a plausible affliction to make a claim on a creature like the benevolent Rabbit King. And I'll explain both of these things, and why I specifically use the word vampire. Let's start with how something like vampirism would even exist in the Constant. If you have played Don't Starve to the point of any full moon, or have ever just fed a pigman too much monster meat in a short time frame, there's a good chance that you've had a fight with a werepig before. And I shouldn't even need to explain what one is, but yes, it is a pig that is afflicted with lycanthropy that can be induced by the moon. However, it can also be triggered with monster meat and its mutagenic effects. This was actually one of the reasons for why I assumed the Bunnymen would have such a hatred of anyone even remotely carrying meat, as they know what it can do, on top of seeing anyone doing it as a possible mass murderer. Pigs aren't the only creature who suffer from mutagenic effects either from monster meat, or even lycanthropy, as Woody has 3 forms of mutation, all of which are induced by consuming monster meat. Walter's dog, Wobby, becomes a giant version of herself when she eats monster meat, and even spiders can mutate into other spiders when eating Weber's monster meat switcherdoodles. Additionally, lycanthropy isn't the only mutation that can occur either, as we have vampire bats in Hamlet who suspiciously drop pig skin, even quoting it as a question mark skin, with the knowledge that monster meat can sometimes induce permanent mutagenic effects. This is all review though if you've seen Monster Meat Theory. As for new things, we know thanks to Daywalker that lycanthropic mutations can be permanent, and with creatures like spelunkies how even phases of the day can cause transformations and become part of a creature. And lastly, we have the Don't Starve Elsewhere trailer that appears to be displaying quite a few large and small bat-like creatures. And a lot of them look rather peculiar to say the least. I mean, look at these sleeping ones. And then look at them fighting alongside this massive bat brute creature, almost as if they are all binded together by something, like maybe they're all slowly mutating it into more bat-like creatures. And since vampires are often significantly referencing of bats, it's a safe claim to make that the creatures in the Elsewhere trailer are vampires. The brute bat even has these same ears as the vampire bats in Hamlet. This thing could have possibly even been the alpha mutator spreading its infection like a virus. And in the last scene, you see gargoyles hopping off pedestals and chasing the survivors like the average Deadlock Ivy player before that same bat brute from earlier flies down on top of the building they found themselves near. That's gargoyles too. It's just tons of vampire references throughout the trailer that are far too much just to be a coincidence. These are vampires. Whether they were turned by monster meat like the lycanthropes, or there's a more specific process to get a more bat-like transformation, is up in the air, but this is a very intentional theme with these creatures. Okay, so vampires not only exist in the Don't Starve universe, but are actually becoming more prevalent and could potentially even become a significant plot point or antagonist in the upcoming title. We don't know exactly how it works, though we can make assumptions based on how other mutations work, and I'd come up with 3 categories where we can log all types of mutations into. Periodic, conditional, and permanent. All are pretty self-explanatory, but periodic mutations are largely going to depend on just points in time that can't really be affected by anything else. These types of mutations include lycanthropy during full moons and spelunkies during their nightmare phases. Then we have conditional mutations, which only activate under specific conditions and could potentially never even occur to the creature. Things like lycanthropy that's induced by monster meat, or spiders mutating into other spiders, wabi growing big, etc. And lastly, we have permanent mutations, where a creature basically has indefinitely turned into something else, and requires some speculation if they were ever anything other than that to begin with. Creatures like this include Daywalker, likely those vampire pigs, the vampire bats, and we can even go a bit further and say hounds too, if I was right about everything in the monster meat theory. So, plugging this into the Rabbit King, and it's obviously a conditional mutation, though strangely has nothing to do with what it eats, rather environmental effects that are causing it to act this way. So let me start giving my claims on why the Rabbit King is a vampire. The first order of business is, although this is not displayed when faced by the Rabbit King himself, for whatever reason, the Bunnymen are all scared of the Rabbit King's antler when it's being wielded by a player, as if they've been conditioned to fear it for whatever reason. Potentially the Rabbit King isn't just wrathful towards us, and remember too, the Rabbit King's cudgel does more damage to both Bunnymen and Rabbit Enforcers, meaning the most ideal weapon in the game to slay Bunnymen is dropped from the Rabbit King. We can see this similar type of fleeing behavior from civilized pigs running from bats, and although standard traditional pigs often don't share this behavior, the correlation is there. Furthermore, 2 of the 3 items the Rabbit King sells you is to actively deceive rabbits and bunnymen, thus making them hunting them pretty effortless as well, as masking violent intentions towards them much easier. Vampires portrayed in fiction are often deceptive with people, having great difficulty detecting them in a population, and are often indistinguishable from the native population with few hideable characteristics. In other words, something that a vampire would likely have and utilize. Lastly, we have the fact that the Rabbit King will both become wrathful if he detects meat from you, but will simultaneously sell you something that allows you to hide the meat from him. And my response to that is that the best way that this makes sense is the Rabbit King isn't getting angry at you holding meat, but rather is smelling the blood in the air, and thus it's invoking a predatory response. In nature, smells are often heavily correlated to remote feeding responses, and essentially, if something smells a certain way, it can actually prevent an otherwise predator from attacking altogether. And looking it through, I honestly think this is one of the best ways to explain why the Rabbit King would sell you this in order to actively deceive him, because he knows you are going to use it to cover up the smell of meat and blood, which would then prevent him from lashing out and attacking you. And lastly, of course, we have the red eyes and the fangs. And because of both of these things, I think that the Rabbit King may actually be a reference to Bunnicula, an older popular children's book about a vampiric rabbit who would suck out the color of vegetables and fruits, though also since it's Don't Starve referencing jackalopes as well, so it just happens to have antlers too. And there you have it. I think it's a plausible enough case that the Rabbit King and what it is a vampiric monster meat mutant that can eat carrots just fine, but when presented with meat, goes somewhat feral and attacks any carriers of the meat. He's not necessarily an evil guy, rather he, like the pigs, harbor a curse that he can't entirely control, but he also makes good use of it to protect himself and his rabbit people. He's even intelligent enough to understand that not all monster creatures are bad, and this is even without him and his followers being considered monsters. As you can see, the pigs aren't attacking him or his followers, so the question then becomes, where the hell did this vampiric rabbit come from? And I once again have a pretty simple answer to that, and it comes from Maxwell. Maxwell in the Don't Starve universe shifts back and forth on topics from being a trusted narrator to not exactly being in the know himself about things. It's safe to assume he built at least a decent amount of things in the Constant, like a lot of these set pieces, hounds, tallbirds, etc., and out of the current cast of playable characters, he was the first and longest ruler on the Shadow Throne, though we don't know who was before him on the Shadow Throne. That being said, Maxwell doesn't consider himself a professional on the world of the Constant, even now stating that he only knows slightly more than the other survivors do. That being said though, Maxwell was capable of creating his own creatures, as shown with the hounds and tallbirds. In other words, whoever is on the throne has some level of genetic manipulation available to him. That's all well and good, but why I bring all this up is before we try and figure out who the Rabbit King is, we have to ask ourselves how long have the rabbits, just regular rabbits, been in the Constant? And I think it's safe to assume that since they do appear to have their hallucinatory effect fundamentally linked with Bunnymen, and we have reason to believe that the Bunnymen got this hallucinatory body due to eating secondhand corrupted carrots that were produced when the Shadows took over the Ancients. Thus, the consumption of corrupted carrots could have occurred any time after the ancient arthropods to even occurring while it was all going down. But I'm led to believe that the actual rabbits came into the picture possibly before Maxwell took the throne. We know Maxwell's quote from the original game's adventure mode being, "There wasn't much when I got here," but we also know that there were previous rulers of the Nightmare Throne, with Pugna's quote in the Forge, "They severed us from the throne," and thus I came up with two possible ideas. One, that I was wrong about Bunnymen being before the rabbits, and that it was actually the rabbits that came before them. I got a minor detail wrong about the ancient arthropods, and that Bunnymen weren't a creature that evolved on their own, but rather they grew into sapient intelligent Bunnymen thanks to the fuel. We know that monster meat has pretty consistent mutagenic effects that can often turn creatures feral and violent. However, this isn't always the case when it comes to just the fuel itself, and can often give what's only described as forbidden knowledge. What if some of this forbidden knowledge was slowly passed on to rabbits as a second-hand consumption of carrots, slowly making them smarter and, although afflicting them with monster-like bouts of insanity in their hallucinatory states, are not ever truly feral or violent creatures? The problems with this, though, are that it wouldn't explain why Bunnymen's direct aversion to meat, nor would it explain why rabbits share this insanity effect, and we even have Winona's quote for a rabbit enforcer.
Interesting.
Or two, that the rabbits were rather not a de-evolution of Bunnymen per se, but rather a split off from them in regards to a different evolutionary pathway. Remember that there is no mention of the Bunnymen or the rabbits for that matter in the murals. Ultimately, I'm not certain how rabbits and Bunnymen are linked, whether Bunnymen devolved into rabbits from the fuel, or the reverse, or that they were alternative evolutionary pathways, or someone even genetically engineered them. I don't know, and fortunately it's not too important to this part of my theory. And it does involve either genetic engineering or the fuel, or both, with Maxwell's quotes for each of the new rabbits. All four of these examination quotes point to Maxwell knowing who this rabbit is on a deeper level, all referencing the name Simon when examining each of the three Rabbit King types, and his enforcers. So the first question being, is Simon the rabbit, or someone else? And although Maxwell has this statement saying, for the wrathful Rabbit King, that Simon is having his cousin fight on his behalf, every other quote leads me to believe that, yes, this Rabbit King is Simon, as I don't think that the Rabbit King is casually just swapping himself with another rabbit, and that all of them are the same rabbit. Additionally, I think I know who exactly Simon is as well. As stated earlier, Maxwell was a magician before entering the Constant, his own name before Maxwell being that of William Carter, having succeeded as a magician after finding the Codex Umbra, which allowed him to use actual shadow magic. His tricks mainly revolved around using the shadows to create all sorts of impressive displays of shadow power up until the shadow power became too much and dragged both him and Charlie into the Constant. This is all review though. However, he had also a previously unsuccessful career as a magician, doing what can only be assumed as simple parlor tricks. He still has this original glasses appearance when he comes across Wolfgang, seemingly before he changed his name to Maxwell. In his old career posters, one of the other images that can be seen is that of him holding a white rabbit over a top hat. A common series of tricks that magicians would do actually involved rabbits of some kind. Thus, with a white rabbit he had likely trained in at least some capacity before he gained shadow power, is it too much to assume that maybe he also imbued his pet rabbit with shadow magic too? An amount he didn't deem as harmful, as Maxwell initially didn't seem like a bad man, but he also would appear unaware of the true darker powers of shadow magic, and the darker waters that it would pull him and Charlie into. The rabbit became smarter, wiser, and more friendly and obedient to his trainer, but shadows being shadows, it also bestowed a hidden downside on him. So when the last show occurred, dragging both Maxwell and Charlie to the Constant, it took Simon the rabbit too. A rabbit that was now in the Constant, and a rather intelligent rabbit at that, who was initially friendly towards everyone regardless of whether they were a monster or not, and even wants to help out by providing his services for free if they indulge him in for one of his old parlor tricks. Unfortunately, the fuel had side effects, and whether Simon was modified similar to how Charlie was when she entered the Constant, or he simply became that, as is from his previous exposure, is up in the air. Simon, being an intelligent rabbit, was now afflicted with a curse of bloodlust, and although he was capable of curtailing it, and even finding ways to mask it by covering the stench of meat, he would still find himself going rabid and wrathful from time to time. It did in fact come in handy when he needed to defend himself, and eventually he came across the Bunnymen. All rabbits and Bunnymen had received doses of fuel from time to time, causing their semi-hallucinatory states, but the Rabbit King, in one of his bouts of bloodlust, realized that he could actually transfer parts of his curse to other rabbits in order to make them better fighters, likely through the carrots that the Rabbit King himself imbued with parts of his own curse, and thus made a handful of royal rabbit enforcers to come to his aid whenever he needed to protect himself or other rabbits. These rabbits, although still disgusted by the meat of their past lives, as meat-hating Bunnymen, still followed the Rabbit King in a sort of pseudo-protectorate class, looking out for the Bunnymen and rabbit populations. And overall, I think that is the loose, though I think still accurate, story of Simon the Rabbit King. He was originally one of Maxwell's magician's tricks, and a friendly yet playful pet, who Maxwell enlightened using the fuel, but when they were sucked into the Constant, although Simon was still friendly, he had declared himself the new king of the rabbits, and would be calling his own shots from this point forward. The fuel didn't come without a cost, however, inflicting a vampiric curse on him, not entirely unlike that of a pigman's lycanthropy, but one that he could also control, and even take advantage of. He now roams anywhere where rabbits are found, both protecting them and offering assistance to those nice enough to offer him carrots or indulge in one of his old magician's parlor tricks. And that, it was enough for me to call this theory done. But there's one more thing I promised to talk about in regards to rabbits and Bunnymen, and this one's mostly unrelated, but it was in those cyborgs in the most recent Elsewhere short. So, let's talk about them. So far in this theory, I've been able to reach out and actually provide evidence and reasoning for all my points, and the proof of what I'm saying being that they largely function in the game world the way I'm depicting them to. People may disagree, but largely I have an alibi for why I think the things that I do. That somewhat changes the tone, though, when I am to theorize of a game that I'm not currently able to play and test myself. And furthermore, we have an abysmally low count of content references for it, being only a single small scene displaying exactly what I want to try and make guesses for. The cyborg Bunnymen. Thus, this last part of the theory will be entirely unprovable speculation, just taking shots in the dark. So, therefore, before anything else, let's start by asking ourselves what these are, as in, if these are even still actual rabbits at all, or they're entirely robotic as a whole. I think it's fair to assume that the bunnies are not purely robotic, in the sense that even if the bunny inside is dead, that it's still using a dead body to function, kind of like Alter. Reason being, there's a pretty clear design intention when it comes to pretty much all of Don't Starve's robots, and it's a very clear clear display of whether or not something is purely robotic. For instance, WX-78 is purely robotic despite having a human brain in some capacity, and has no humanity left save for the thoughts a human brain can produce. These rabbit cyborgs, on the other hand, display an open mouth similar to that of an animal, and have stitch marks along the back, all indicating that this isn't just a robot and has some level of biological makeup to it. Now, as for whether or not the rabbits are dead and are just being puppeted around, and who made them is entirely up in the air. So, let's start by looking around for context clues. It's pretty obvious they are underground in some way, as the area is completely dark. The previous clip had characters just walking into an opening in a cliffside, and there are these gunk-like pillars we see inside that we can also note inside the caves of DST, notably usually near ancient or marsh-like areas, being the cave-like or algae or whatever it is. In the brief animation, we also see the same gunk-like substance on the ceiling as well. We also see these robot-like cart things walking around too. We can very briefly see in the corner a third bunny cyborg due to his eyes glowing in the dark, and lastly there appears to be other broken equipment in the area like ladders and whatnot. So while we ask whether or not these rabbits are still alive, we also need to ask both why they were built and who built them. And I think why they were built is going to be the easiest of these three to answer, because I can only come up with two different ideas. The first being for simple labor and resource gathering. They have drills on their hands, and there's carts down there too. Probably also created by the same ones who made them, possibly to collect this gunk and use it as a fuel source, or just clean up the area by drilling it down. Overall, I think this is the simplest answer. They are here to do simple labor, but it would explain why they are hostile to the players, unless of course they were no longer alive and it was just their programming telling them to attack. The second idea is that they were made for combat, and specifically to fight back infestations of some kind. Look around in the trailer and you will see multiple other passageway doors leading into the underground caves of this world. This biome is likely a common area in these elsewhere domains. Additionally, we see in the trailer multiple groups, all that could be categorized as an infestation, or at least something that other sapient creatures would generally want to wipe off the map. The first being the most prominent, that of the vampire bats running around and likely infecting other creatures, and the other being these reanimated dolls that appear to attack near sources of light. Both are possibilities, though I lean more on the side of the vampires if they were made for defense. It could even be for this giant plant thing. I'm sure Alter sent it down to collect taxes or something. Okay, so they were either made for labor or combat. That makes sense. Now, who built them? This one is kind of either only one answer, or we don't really know what it would be otherwise, because currently there is only one group of sapient creatures shown in the trailer, the goat people. Possibly the pigmen, because we see the vampires, but that's not confirmed. I mean, this Mirelurk-like crab might be sapient, as we have seen sapient crabs, i.e. Pearl, but nothing is confirmed, and I kinda doubt they would build them.
A Mirelurk!
The goats are the only ones we see talking, and more importantly, we see them purging around ruins and fires. And we can even see in the background that they managed to slay one of those doll things. Additionally, there's more broken equipment around them, similar to what we find in the caves. And this is also the clip played right after the Bunnymen cyborgs. It does feel as though there is a linking to goats having maybe been behind the creation of these Bunnymen cyborgs. They don't appear to be super technologically advanced, but they also don't appear to be intellectual pushovers either, as we can reference the types of buildings they made in the Gorge. I have every reason to believe it's the same race of goat people in there, and they look to be in the same style as the ones we see in Elsewhere, meaning the main, or at least one of the main civilized factions in Elsewhere is likely going to be that of the goats, who appear to be fairly intelligent, fairly more so, arguably, than even the pigs of Hamlet. So, we have only one question left to ask. Are these Bunnymen still alive? Now, there's a chance that the Bunnymen in this area are extinct. We didn't see any other mention of them in the trailer, and there's no shortage of creatures here for them to fight, and we know that Bunnymen, and how they're often gung-ho and aggressive towards monsters, and violent towards anything that even picks up meat. The goats may have taken that into account when looking for candidates to help them deal with the rising monster threat in this world. The Bunnymen may have a sort of alliance going on with the goats, similarly to how the swamp pigs were able to peacefully coexist with the goats in the marshes of the Gorge. But ultimately, I think the Bunnymen cyborgs here are either extremely augmented to the point to where they aren't really seen as Bunnymen anymore, or that they are simply reanimated cadaver. Remember, they are inside an area where there's broken equipment and machines, and meaning, for all we know, they could have just been abandoned down there due to their creators getting overwhelmed and having to retreat, causing the Bunnymen to, over time, become almost husk-like, and eventually hostile towards even potential friendly units. But whether they're machines, cop corpses, or alive cyborgs, they were most likely at one point still Bunnymen, or at least a reference to them. And since we know that the rabbits have a king looking out for them, it's safe to say that their story isn't over yet in the constant, and that is the bunny theory. And that is the bunny theory, a single character being added to a faction that we seemingly already had figured out, only to find out that their story may not be as open and closed as we initially thought in regards to the rabbits and the Bunnymen. Yes, the Rabbit King alone was a good addition to the lore of these creatures, and displays a past with the previous Shadow Throne ruler Maxwell, but the fact that there are Bunnymen on different islands than the mainland as proven in Elsewhere, as we had so far never seen a rabbit or Bunnyman anywhere else on the mainland. Because of this, there may in fact be more to them than even investigated about here in this theory, with cyborg robot-like creatures in their near future just waiting for us to figure out more about them. This whole experience also does prove something else important, and that's that Maxwell was wrong when examining Billy. The goat people do have a future after all too, as some of them have survived, and since we can make a heavy assumption that the buildings in these areas are belonging to that of the goat people, that they may even have one of the more advanced and prevalent societies in the constant. Maybe even the merms from the gorge will find a way to turn back, and their societies could even rival that of the pigmen. As for me, I look forward to hearing about all of these three societies and their worlds in the constant, and if all three of them do end up making another comeback.